Hi, I'm Daniel with Art Cyclery, and today we're going to cover suspension setup on Ask a Mechanic. Whether you have a short travel bike or a long travel bike, either way, suspension setup is really important to getting a great ride. In addition to covering all the basics, I'm also going to go over some of the common mistakes that riders tend to make when setting up their suspension. As we go through the suspension setup process, I'll explain the purpose of each component that we're adjusting. The only special tool you'll need to do this work yourself is a shock pump. These high pressure pumps are an absolute necessity. A standard bike pump just won't work. So the first area of consideration is the spring. For most bikes, this is an air spring. For others, it's a coil made from steel or titanium. The spring is what holds you up as you ride along. They're very simple devices that squish down when force is applied to them. The spring stores that force as potential energy and releases it when the spring rebounds. In order for your suspension to hold you up properly, the spring has to be tuned to your weight and any mechanical leverage applied to it through the suspension linkage. Since the vast majority of bikes have air springs, that's what we'll use as our example. The way to figure out how much air pressure you need is to check your suspension sag. This is how far the shock or fork compresses when you're on the bike. Most bike manufacturers design their suspension to work best with 25 to 30% sag. If your bike has RockShox suspension, it's really easy to check your sag with these printed gradients on their stanchion. Just push the floating O-ring up against the dust wiper, then get on your bike while using a wall for support so you can get into a normal descending position. Then carefully get off the bike and see where the O-ring ended up. If you're within 25 to 30%, you're set. If you have too much sag, add air pressure and repeat the sag check process until you get within range. If you have too little sag, set the air pressure lower and then recheck. If you don't have RockShox suspension components, you'll need to do some measuring and some simple multiplication to figure out your sag. If you have a new bike, the bike manufacturer's website typically lists the rear shock stroke dimension. This is the distance the shock stanchion can compress until it bottoms out. If you don't have access to that dimension, you can measure it yourself. I strongly recommend using a metric measuring device because it'll make the math we do later a whole lot easier. Just measure the distance between the shock or fork's dust wiper and 2 or 3 millimeters from the end of the stanchion. If it's a fork, measure from the dust wiper to 5 millimeters from the bottom of the fork crown. That dimension is your stroke. Take this dimension and multiply it by 0.25 and write down your answer. Then take the stroke dimension and multiply it by 0.3 and write down your answer. These two answers make up the range of sag you're looking for. Use your O-ring and measuring device to check that you have your spring adjusted to achieve the correct sag. With the sag adjusted, we can now move on to damper setup. The damper is absolutely critical because a spring without a damper just has no control. You just bounce along like characters in a Hollywood Western riding along in a carriage. Compare that to a desert racing trophy truck that glides along smoothly as its wheels pinball over the rocks below. It's damping that keeps the truck riding smoothly over the bumps. What we're looking for on mountain bike suspension is something in between these two extremes, so we can have control, but also be able to push against the suspension to boost off of bumps in the trail. Damping controls how fast your suspension is allowed to compress and rebound. Compression damping keeps you from using too much travel for a given hit. Rebound damping controls the shock or fork's return to normal ride height or top out after a hit compresses it. Nearly every shock or fork has adjustable rebound damping because it's the most important component of damper setup. It's also the area where I see a lot of people getting into trouble when working on their own suspension. The most common problem is not enough rebound damping, and this makes the suspension a little too bouncy. When it's too bouncy, the bike bobs a lot when you're pedaling, and you get arm pump from trying to control all the high frequency oscillations. And you get bucked after big hits or when riding off jumps. To make rebound adjusters easy to identify, nearly all of them are either completely red or have some red graphics on them in addition to a text label. Some high-end shocks and forks have 2 rebound adjusters, one for high speed and one for low speed. To keep things simple in this basic video, we're only going to cover low speed rebound damping. And a lot of that is because if you only have one rebound knob, it's always going to be a low speed rebound adjuster. Low speed rebound adjustment controls roughly the top 2/3 of your suspension travel. In my opinion, the easiest way to get your rebound adjustment in the right range is to turn the adjuster clockwise when looking at the top of the adjuster knob. until the suspension starts rebounding noticeably slowly after compressing it, something that looks like this. The end state we're after is to be able to compress your suspension down through about 2/3 of the travel and then have it return just a little bit slower than you can retract your hands. For rear suspension, it's the saddle you're pressing against instead of the grips, but it's the same idea. Now that the suspension is too slow, turn the rebound knob counterclockwise 2 clicks and compress the suspension again to test it. Once you get to that point where you feel the grips pressing firmly into your palms throughout the fork's rebound, then turn the rebound knob back clockwise 1 or 2 clicks to slow it down, and you're done. That's it. It's that simple. Just in case your rebound knob gets reset at some point in the future, it's always good to know how many clicks of rebound you're using, so you can get back to that same place. To do that, just count the number of clicks it takes to tighten the rebound knob all the way clockwise and write down the number of clicks it took to get there. Then turn the knob back counterclockwise the same number of clicks to return to the right setting. Out on the trail, I recommend doing some experimentation, just 1 click above or below this setting you arrived at in the shop, to get it where you like it best. If you have a rebound knob that doesn't click when you turn it, you have a more basic damper with about 1/3 of a turn for the full range of adjustment. In that case, put the knob in whichever position gets you to the same return speed point I described earlier. The direction of adjustment is the same, with clockwise rotation slowing the suspension down. You can mark your preferred position with a Sharpie to save it for later. Now, before we dive into compression damping, I do want to say that it is the most misunderstood and hardest to adjust part of any suspension component. And it's because it's a really subtle adjustment that often can only be felt out on the trail, if it can be felt at all. In fact, a lot of pro riders even struggle with it and often rely on mechanics and even data acquisition devices to help them arrive at the right setting. So keep that in mind as we go through this next section. So with that warning out of the way, let's talk about low-speed compression. Adding low-speed compression damping stabilizes the suspension during slower compression inputs and limits bobbing caused by pedaling or fork dive caused by braking. A really common mistake is using too much low-speed compression damping, resulting in a harsh ride. If your fork has low-speed compression damping adjustment, it's usually a blue or black knob and often doubles as a lockout lever. To avoid making the ride too harsh, I recommend giving your compression knob just 1 or 2 clicks clockwise from all the way open. Rear shocks rarely have compression adjusters and simply have a lockout lever for firming up the suspension when riding on the road or when climbing. If you have one of these levers, just be sure not to have your suspension locked out on a descent. It just wears out the seals of the shock a lot faster, leading to leaks, and the only way to fix it is to do a full shock overhaul. And that means you're going to be off the bike for a while, and no one wants that. High-speed compression adjustments are beyond the limited scope of this basic suspension video. So if you have any dampers with high and low-speed compression adjusters, just follow the recommended compression damping base settings found in your model's user manual setup guide. My goal here is to keep suspension setup simple, so you can avoid the common pitfalls that most people run into when they're working on it. Because really, we're all out here to have fun, and a well set up suspension makes your bike really fun. Don't forget to talk to your local bike shop and get their suggestions on suspension setup. They know the trails you ride, and they can offer you some great advice that's unique to where you ride.